YOLO Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another little loop I have prepared for you. It's not the most amazing loop in the world. It still needs actually a ton of work, but it is something for us to work on, which is the point of these exercises, so that we can grow and progress and move forward. So it's something I whipped up for you, and there's a couple of cool things about it. We're going to be talking about how sub bass can augment this in terms of layering, including things like messing with the fundamental, because that's pretty important for the types of sounds we're working with. So let me really quick just play it for you. I'll let it go through like twice. So here you go. So a pretty interesting deal. As I said before, there's still a ton that could really happen to this. It's not really been pulled together in a comprehensive way quite yet. But the point is just to experiment with some sub bass. So that makes it perfect for working with. So before we do anything, I want to show you something sort of interesting about this bass line that is just really kind of cool. And it ties right into our sub bassing. So we've talked about how making small changes to the fundamental of a waveform can have a big impact on the way the waveform sounds. If you run it through something like a nonlinear distortion quite heavily, such as what I'm doing with this sound, messing with the phase of the signal can have a tremendous impact. One way we can mess with the phase, there's actually more ways than just changing the fundamentals phase, is we could change the phase by augmenting the tuning by like a fractional amount, like a super tiny amount. So here it looks like my detune is off, but if we click, you see it's at a value of 2. And so right now, if we listen to that the big bass thing, you can't miss it. It's pretty bright and out there. Well, check it out. What if I move this to 0? That's a pretty small amount, but listen to what happens in the processing. I actually quite like both timbres, but as you can see, it's these small amounts. Like, let's just put it on 1. Let's hear what 1 sounds like. Versus 0. Versus, say, 12. Now there's actually quite a bit more happening here. But when we have these super, super tiny amounts, such as 2, which I cannot seem to get to, that's what's happening, is we have a phase off shift and it changes the way our processing takes place. So when we're doing things like creating these big bass sounds, that's really important to know about, because that could either be the reason your sound doesn't sound that great, or it sounds really good. Another thing to be careful of is if your sound is continuously having its phase change, then you could have an extremely high flux in your sound and not necessarily know why. And that could actually be really, really tiny things. So just things to be aware of. So I wanted to show you that because it's pretty crazy, right? So in here, I go ahead and I sort of explain that. But anyways, here's our goal. So our goal is to add a layer to one of the sounds in a way that reinforces it, ideally a subtone, not necessarily a subtone. And then go ahead and try it out. So what I have here is, first, if you have not yet done this, pause the video, step away from this YouTube channel and go try it, and then come back, and I'm about to do it. So anyways, there was your chance to do it. So we have a couple of sounds. We could affect the bass, we could affect the chords, and we could affect the drums, right? And then we have a couple other sounds. So if we were to just look at these sounds and say, well, what are some good candidates for messing with sub? So first, let's just solo. Well, we've got these chord stabs. By the way, all of these sounds are Synth 1 sounds. So we've got these chords. So there's the chords, pretty like, you know, upbeat stuff. We have our big bass sound we've already become acquainted with. And you can hear the reverb is being limited. Was that on 7? I think I did put it on 7. Yep, I did. And that's just to keep it under wraps. A lot of times I hear tracks from people will send me their tracks. I don't, honestly, it's a little like, I get too many. And when they, I get this a lot where they'll put a reverb on the bass, but then it'll just really blow through their whole song. It really ruins the drums a lot of times. So this is one way you could deal with that. I quite liked the way this sounded, so I went with that. And then we have these little stab things. And the way these work, they're basically like little really quick arpeggios with, I believe I stayed completely internal on these, with the tempo delay and chorus on them. Let's see if I tossed anything on in post. Nope, it was all internal. So the delay and everything's right here. And then finally, so if we listen to this, like, oh, well, if I were to add sub to this, probably wouldn't be that great because it's pretty high. So if I add a sub, it's more like I'm just changing the fundamental. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we also have these pads, which are, well, not necessarily pads. They call them pad colors, but they're these tones that come in to sort of be a counter statement to the bass. As you can see, they come in, it sort of works with the bass, but they also respond to these chords. And it also has some of this filter movement. And if we play the chords, you can hear this sort of conversation going on where they're talking to each other. So that's just like kind of general songwriting. So there you go. There's some of that going on. And so that's the basics. So that's the basics of what's going on. So first, let's go ahead. Let's look at this bass thing, right? Like, what can we do with the bass? Well, we've done this in a previous video already. So we know, well, if I just slap a subtone on there, I could get some pretty low, it's that low sort of churgly. I don't know. I just made up a word for that. That's what I feel like saying, though. Churgly, sort of this low bass thing. I picture like a big tubby guy that's just really got some momentum going. So if we just listen to this, let's do a sine wave first. Let's boost this up to like 15. So these results can be very useful at a low rate. Now, I assumed, if you're brand new at this, you probably went right for the lead bass one patch and turned up the sub. And if you turn it up enough, like something like that, usually you get stuff that it kind of ruins it. And it depends on which one you pick. Like with the sine wave, it's actually not that bad. We have other issues like this is going to eat up all the low end and make it hard for other things in the mix to come through. So if we're going to do this sort of a sound, it better be either syncopated in a way that doesn't get in the way of other things, or it's just a sound we'd rather listen to. But if we pick like another thing like a saw wave, you get these sorts of things. So pretty cool grimy textures. Sometimes they come out really bad. It also depends on how you're processing things with flangers and choruses, things of that nature. If we put it at the fundamental, because right now we're an octave low, we get stuff like. Whereas, and like as you can see, it makes like hardly any difference at all. If we go over to like our sine wave, turn that up. This is going to cause more masking. Now, we've talked about this in the layering video, where if we choose these are going to make it sound brighter. And when we get to how things run through distortions, this will make it sound substantially brighter. And in this case, since it's already got like a super bright sound, it sounds like it's almost not there. But things like the triangle and sine wave, as we explored in like the previous exercise video, it was either that one or the one before that. There was only two before. These ones have their harmonics drop off much faster, so they will encourage a duller sound. Or the general nature of the sound will be brought towards the fundamental instead of the upper to low mid harmonics. And this one as well. So now this is being run through a distortion, which will again augment the higher harmonics, whereas the sine wave is just the lower harmonics. So you're hearing just one series being generated in addition as a response to the sine wave being used. So anyways, there you go. So there's like, we have a bunch of interesting options with the sub. Pick one you like and use it. Now these could be static. Just a reminder, maybe we could do something like this. So we could go to like automate, browse parameters. I used to have a custom shortcut for this, but I just find myself doing this. So we could add one, right? And maybe we want it to become more aggressive here. Maybe you don't want it the whole time. So we could have something like this. Or maybe we have it start out like that and then go down and back up. Like this. You know, you could get creative, yo. Put it right here, somewhere that makes sense. and away you go. You could create a really dynamic moving sound. Now, this isn't the best example, but I mean, you're picking up what I'm putting down, hopefully. So anyways, don't have to remain static. So there's some stuff about the bass. Let's see if there's anything else. Now, another thing is I sort of make a big deal out of like things being ruined here, where they aren't really getting ruined, but in some sounds, it really does ruin the sound, like a lot. And so you might be wondering, what do I do in those cases? Well, here I give a suggestion that these tones generated by these low ends here aren't always bad. Sometimes you just put too much. So consider just edging down to a ratio that you like and mixing it in there. Now, you could also do a layer, try a separate sub as we've experimented with before. A whole bunch of things. I list a whole bunch of different types of suggestions, but I'm already pretty happy with where it is. I kind of like the low end of this a tad. Now you hear right there, when we go low enough, that's the problem, that sometimes it gets ruined. On that really low note, it's just too low. This completely ruins it. That one right there. And you notice that only occurred after a certain volume level. Before that low note, it's like the one, is it here? I think it's that one. If we turn this up enough. Oh, I'm automating it too now. Gosh, dang it. Just a sec. We could go to patterns, initialize controls, bass lead sub oscillator 1. Is that the one I want? Yeah, that is. Okay, so now we should be free to manipulate. That's from the level. So you might be going, why is that? Well, that's because you've given so much emphasis to that harmonic. Well, yeah, this is like a sort of a really simplified way of looking at it. Basically, we've amplified it so much that it overwhelms our processing. And that's all we really need to know and then we just bring it back a little bit. Now here we say, well, this just is not a good idea. So maybe like very low, like just a smidgen. That could be considered usable. So this might also limit your range, but you might accomplish a timbre you really like. And that's not a bad thing. A lot of instruments, if you play clarinet, there's certain notes you just can't play because you chose to play clarinet. So, I mean, it's not a bad thing to have a limited range. We don't have to have every single note available to us, like as far as like the whole range, like a piano style deal. So anyways, there are some things to consider. Now, if we move on to the chords, we have some additional options. Now I totally bring up something in here that is, we notice our chords are kind of bright in this song, and this comes up all the time. This sort of technique also probably has the most application to chords. The bass is pretty close as far as amount of variation you could get out of it. And if we include automation, we could just, skip out those low notes that don't sound that great and put them on the ones that do and accomplish a really nifty sound. But here on the chords are also very useful. And we explored this a bit in previous videos. But if we look here, I want to read this to you. Currently, our chords sound is very high and shrill. This helps it stand out in the track, but it's not exactly warm. To gain a warmer sound, we may consider bringing the notes down, but then it sounds thin. So for you, let's do that. Let's go over here. Let's take our chords. Whoops, I added a note. So here's our chord stabs, right? Whoa, bring them down. Maybe that's just like, I'm not really digging that. Maybe it's too thick in this case. Maybe thin isn't the right word. But anyways, that obviously wasn't something that we wanted to do. So we say, we may be tempted then to add notes. So maybe we go, oh, well, maybe we just need more notes. So we take this whole thing. I used to do this all the time. I would do stuff like that. I would just bring it down an octave. But that's a bad idea too. You don't want to do that because then you've got too many notes, all these extra notes. It's crazy. And so we say, okay, well, that's not exactly it. So we may add extra notes. So we get back to the original and instead decide a layer is probably our best bet. So here so a layer is probably going to be the easiest way because then we could be a little more specific with what we want to do. Maybe layer only certain notes, but that's a little extra work more than we're looking for something for just an easy tonal variation. So what we could do as well, we could come over here and we could look at the subsection. And it's similar to layering down additional notes, except for the sub, we could look at it from a sine wave and triangle wave perspective. If we layer in, so if we just go ahead and play this, we could bring in some saw waves down an octave below. And this is different in that we are not inviting the exact same spectrum in. Now with the saw wave, we are. But we can essentially layer it with these other waveforms and vary the volume. Now other synths have much more extensive options for this, which are a lot more powerful. But I just want to introduce it here as an idea. So if we bring in some more saw waves an octave below. So before we had, bring this back up. Now, if we compare that to bringing the notes down an octave, it's not nearly as muddy as the other option was. So if we come over here and bring these down. So it's kind of interesting that we have this variation going on, but it's in that we are inviting extra additional notes. Now, even with the saw wave, it still doesn't sound. And it's because we have that reduced volume level. So mixing is mixing your volume levels. This isn't even really mixing more, as if you were to have an instrumentalist, they would naturally do this. But when you write a chord, not all the notes should be the same level. Now you'll see a lot of tracks that I write, well, I'll have parts that do that, but I also have a lot of parts that have various volume levels. It just depends on what I was focusing on when I was making that part. So I'm thinking of adding some sine waves, which typically sound kind of like clingy together. Like if I were to open up a citrus and play a, where the heck is citrus? Come on, man. There it is. Okay, so if I were to open this up, not that, this, and go to my default patch. If I play a bunch of sine waves together, you get a lot of combination tones and things that aren't really there. Your ear puts in there. That's an issue. However, this is actually a psychoacoustic effect. You could go look it up in the critical listening series. So, however, we do not get that issue here because of all the phasing that's already happening, because we already have a big pad signal. So that all that sort of clinging, clashing sound goes away. Sometimes actually it's a good thing. It makes the sine wave sound the way it does. But if I go ahead and play for it, here's the original. And we bring this up just a smidge to like 33. That's actually quite a bit, but here we go. Also notice that there's quite a bit of masking, and from the layering video, this should now, I shouldn't have to say this as much anymore. You're going to expect that anytime you add in a waveform and boost the fundamental. So we'll expect a natural diminishing of the upper harmonic spectrum. Now we could try a similar thing with the triangle wave, so without it. Now the triangle wave has upper harmonics, so we still expect a diminishing because there's not very many upper harmonics, but it will also maintain it a bit better than the sine wave did. So I quite like that. That sounds pretty cool. And then of course we could do the saw wave, and we saw earlier what that sounds like, and also the square wave. It's kind of interesting, since the square wave only contains odd harmonics, how it like creates a different sort of feel than the saw wave would. There's like, it's like a little bit thinner, and that could be really useful in a mix. So when you're doing that and there's not a huge difference, because sometimes there isn't, if you already have a whole bunch of thick saw waves going out, you can't always tell that there's like a thick square wave in there. Sometimes it just sounds like a interesting sounding saw waves. Like saw waves are kind of an interesting deal because you can have all these subtleties that are hard to distinguish. So anyways, there's some things about the chords, very useful. Now you want to keep in mind that this could change your chord progression. In this case, since all our lines are on the same, since we wrote block chords, it's fine. But if we were to write chords in a little more sophisticated way, we'd want to make sure that we don't introduce a voice lower than the lowest voice, as that could really mess up our inversions. And then we also could be messing up voice leading if we do anything with this that makes voices cross. So just gotta be careful. I don't think that's an issue for anyone watching these videos though, usually. And if you do know what I'm talking about right now, then you know how to avoid it as well. So, okay, chords. So that's the chords thing. And then I also go over a little bit of the different options, you know, sine, saw, triangle, square. These are like typical waveforms. You want to get familiar with just the sounds they offer. And then I also wanted to bring an interesting thing to length. So two of the components, the aspects of music, of the 6 aspects of music, there were 2. There were short and long. The shorter a sound is, the less bass will have an impact. So if a sound is super duper short, you will hear almost no bass. And the reason is we are less sensitive to bass frequencies. Low frequencies, we have to turn up in order to hear an equal volume level. Now, it depends on how loud you're listening. So things will level out generally the louder you go. You can look up the Fletcher-Munson curves. And again, the critical listening series talks about this. So what that translates to, why it means anything to you, is that if you pick a sound that is very short and you're going to boost the low end, you're going to have to boost it a lot more than you would a long sound, because a longer sound will have the wave exists for a longer time, and therefore we have a longer time to perceive it, and so we'll be able to hear it better. And since these low waveforms we have a hard time hearing, it just translates to not very good. We have to add quite a bit of bass to a very short sound in order to get the same effect. We would have to add maybe like half as much bass to like a long bass tone. So for now, if we were to add bass to like hats, that'd be just a really hard thing to do. But if we were to add it to our kick drum, if we have a short kick, we're going to have a harder time doing that. The longer our kick is, the easier it will be for us to hear the bass sound, the sort of the kick in our bass. So if we're going to add, say, bass to this little ARP thing I have going on here, that's going to be pretty hard to do. And so when we add a sub here, first off, this isn't going to be like a real sub. Like when I say adding a sub, I mean like a couple octaves down. If we were to take this and move it down, like you see that it doesn't even sound like it has a pitch anymore. And you can barely hear the bass. What you're hearing is the upper harmonic crunch. If you really listen, there's no real low sub end. It's just like a mid-range crunch. So that's kind of where there you can hear a pitch and you hear everything that's going on. So that's my point. With things like a kick drums are sort of a special case because they typically have a pitch bend. So they're sneaky because they're usually, first off, they're longer than usual percussion sounds. So that immediately already gives them an advantage. But the beginning of a kick has the click where there's almost no sub at all. And then there's this pitch bend. There's this frequency that brings your ear down into the low end, which guides you, which makes you more sensitive to the low end than you would otherwise be. Typically, not all kicks do this, but a fair amount of them do. And then there's that periodic part of the waveform that we looked at. So here we have this like short end, almost no bass will be heard if we were to just chop it off to that. If we were to just, like there's almost none. But if we let it ring out a bit more, we get a feeling for a lower end because the sound is longer. We also have a frequency going down slightly. If we were to look at this in a EQ, we see there's a boom, boom. There's this red sort of line. It happens very quick. Some kicks are built around this idea. So there's a really obvious one, and some don't have this at all. They usually don't have too much of a bass impact unless they're rather long. And so there's a whole bunch of, all I'm saying is just special stuff that happens with a kick. And there's also all these upper frequencies, which are kind of a whole nother story as well. So when we look at something like this, when we add the low end, we saw that it did almost nothing for us. But if we add a sub to this, it's like we're just going down an octave. So we're not going down all the way. So we've essentially just layered in a lower version of the sound using a different wave. So if we bring this in versus, am I on the right thing? This is the chord tab. I'm not on the right thing. I'm like, what the heck? Where is it? Here it is. Okay. So if we bring in the low end, let's do a square wave. Now that has a big difference, and that's because the low end, now, because we don't hear linearly, there's a bunch of interesting sort of rules that happen. Not really rules, but just effects. So if I open this up, let's take a look at the spectrum real quick here. So here's the spectrum. And if I were to remove this, So it looks pretty much very similar, but it sounds super different. You might be going, what the heck's going on? What happened? Well, what happened is a series of masking. So every frequency that goes up the spectrum is now being coupled with a square wave, emphasizing every other harmonic, because all the odd harmonics, and because those are being emphasized up the square wave, it masks out the even harmonics, and the square wave tonality takes over. It's as if we don't have the sine wave, this wave on at all. Like if I turn this off, just go to a square, that's what we have. And so we're sort of mixing the two. We're also running things through a flanger and a delay to sort of complicate it, but that's not too big of a deal as far as choosing our source sound. So that's an interesting thing. Now you did hear it still sounds like super different. Part of that is because I had that turned off. Okay, so that's not why it sounds that way. But part of that is just I'm going through additional effects as well. So I didn't get the true square wave sound out of there. And we're also playing quite high. And interesting things happen as far as how synths deal with very high frequencies. Some do oversampling, some don't. I don't believe this one does. I haven't like messed with it in that regard. So anyways, we could choose a sound though that does lower harmonics. And we've already discovered that this will cause masking to occur. So if we were to play it with a sine wave and bring this up now, because these things are still happening in this range, we don't need to boost these as much to hear their effect because they're still in our comfortable hearing range. It's down here-ish that we start having a hard time with hearing them if they're really short. So if the sound was down there, that's why we only heard the upper to mid-range crunch. Now if we were to like go to like triangle wave. So these are really powerful as far as like layering capabilities when we're dealing with short sounds with these waveforms because we're more sensitive in these areas of the spectrum. So if you're writing for like a video game, you can accomplish a lot more timbres quite easily with layering than you otherwise would be able to in a low range or in an excessively high range. For similar problems we would run into in the low range, we're not as sensitive to those frequencies. And these frequencies you don't want to hear these very loud anyways, unless they're part of a spectrum. You want them to be accompanied by some mid-range, trust me. So that's what's going on. There you have it. I had a great plan in mind for this, and I think it came together all right. So now you have some ideas on when you listen to a track like this, and you think, wow, I could add, how can I augment this? Hopefully some ideas have occurred. And we've already looked at emphasizing a kick drum in a lesson before where we layered in a sine wave with a kick and really messed with the kick. So we've already messed with that a bit, but there you have it. So listening to it now, see if the way you hear it's different than the way you heard it before. If you maybe hear more possibilities, additional options maybe you could get at through sound design that could maybe benefit your track a little bit. Let's go to the, I want to lower the stabs a bit. Bump, dun, dun. And I wouldn't settle on that bass all the way and maybe add, see now we could talk about layering too. It's pretty cool. We could talk about some sound design style things. See, I like that more. And then here, I'm like, okay, well, that bass sounds pretty bright. What's a way I could get the bass from sounding bright, but not lose the clarity that it has right now? Because now, if I change it to the other way, I might be sacrificing some other attributes. Well, I think, I could add it as some sort of a long pad I could layer it with another long pad, and it would muffle some of that mid-range that the bass is currently outputting. So, for example, I mean, this might turn out really bad. This is just an experiment, but it's now we have like ideas. We're like, oh, I could try this. So I don't like maybe the high end, how bright that is. Maybe I don't want it that bright. Well, I could try adding in just like a sine wave, perhaps right at the fundamental, and then augment the volume to try and get something that fits it better. So I'm going to put it right here, and I'm going to name it like bass layer 1. And then from here, I could move to other spectrums and change it to be something more appropriate. I'm going to move it up here by my lead bass. My lead bass is red. Oh, it's because it's a lead. So normally if I have guitars, those are red, but I'll occasionally make leads and stuff red as well. So first, let's see. That's pretty low. That's pretty good. Now I want my attack to be a bit quicker than that. Maybe not that fast, like 40. Okay. And so let's see if we can't augment how bright it is by just turning this up. And it's pretty interesting how just a separate sub like that really rounds out the sound. It's got it like, so, okay, let's do a little bit before and after. So here it is before. And here it is after. Like that's a pretty big difference in my opinion. If we get rid of it. And here it is after. Now, it might be a little over excessive, so let's bring it back a bit. So there you go. Some pretty clear ideas. I think it sounds pretty sweet. If you have any questions about this, let me know. I'm not going to save the changes. I may have accidentally hit Control S somewhere in this tutorial. It's a bad habit. Actually, it's a really good habit. You should have that habit. I've saved a number of project files because I just have a Control S habit. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. I really appreciate it. It does take quite a while to make tutorials of this nature just because there's a lot of forethought that goes into this, and I want it to be comprehensive and have a direction as opposed to just sort of rambling, which even then I still kind of do a little bit. But I feel like it's beneficial rambling with the direction a little bit. Subscribe and have a blessed day.